afraid that this is an ignorant and obvious question, but I'm curious, moving forward, what's the relationship with like Blockly and Scratch, and whether users should try to use the Scratch blocks library or use Blockly directly? Where is that headed?
So I think that depends on what you want to use it for. The Scratch team is, and this is my understanding, is mostly focused on the Scratch application. So you might not get as much developer support. But if you are building something that wants to use that their runtime or a bunch of the other tools that they've built out that do more than just the block coding, it is open source. If you want, like our team is dedicated to supporting Blockly as a library. So if the block editor is what you need and you want a strong developer support, lots of developer documentation, we're kind of a foundational library that you can build on.
Hi, everyone. So I have a question. It's not necessarily very technical, but I do want to understand, and taking advantage that I'm meeting you all in person. Whenever it comes to think about Blockly and thinking about block-based programming, what or who do you think is the end user for having a library like Blockly? Why did you come out with this technology, and kind of like what is the community or what is the kind of user that you have in mind when it comes to designing and bringing out this library?
So Neil might have some comments on the original user and audience, which as was mentioned, Blockly did come out of App Inventor. It was originally a redesign of App Inventor that when App Inventor moved out of Google to MIT, Neil kept developing and turned into a generic tool. So our primary user, and in part that's because we sit under the education org, are novice programmers, people who are just learning how to program. And so that's why we tend to prioritize educational use cases. But that being said, we also know that there are a lot of users who are not educational. They use it for business logic or robotics, other applications that are not focused on education, that are maybe just focused on enabling different applications. And so we support those as best we can. It's just when we prioritize what features to work on next, we tend to prioritize education features first.
So Eric, I was intrigued when you said that you were looking at mobile phone UI. Can you talk more about that, or give us some little insight on what you're thinking?
Eric just said, what if Andrew wants to talk?
Hi, everyone. So I was initially working on the Blockly team as part of the Android implementation, which we have since deprecated for lack of enough developer time. I say we as if I'm still on the team, but whatever. I've done some experiments in terms of what can fit on a screen, particularly ways to cross the boundary between textual UI and drag and drop block UI. They're not finished. They're showing good progress, or not progress, but potential, I think. And you can find it on GitHub at, let's see, github.com/Google/codewords. And it's like Blockly, a web-based implementation. It's very crude, has very simple primitives at this point. It needs to be fleshed out in that respect, but does try and do JavaScript presented textually in a way that is draggable with animated affordances for where drop points could be within the textual presentation. So this is an attempt to work within the bounds of the limited screen real estate, but at the same time present as much code as possible, particularly when it's not interacting with, and also on the as a replacement for the toolbox that uses keyboard text input as a search interface, because most people who have phones know how to type on their phones. So looking at a very different approach than Blockly, but it was an experiment, and I hope to continue on with that at some point.
Okay, I wish to ask if you have maybe plans to develop an application using Blockly, or you only keep on focusing on producing the API?
Neil makes Blockly games and maintains that and is expanding it periodically and builds things with that. That gets used more than we actually ever expected that it would get used. And that's a good test bed for us. That is one of the first places that we go for whether a change that we make is breaking to Blockly users, actually. The team is not beyond that building out any applications for publishing.
Thank you.
So I would maybe want like a little bit of everyone's opinion on this, because I think people might have different ideas. But if you were going to, like if you were tasked with rewriting Blockly from scratch, what is the number one thing that you would change about it?
Hi, well, I just started this week, so I don't have too much context. But I guess I will be working with on making the demo for real-time collaboration, so potentially the events. I'll find out more, but yeah.
Hi, I'm Monica. I am similarly somewhat new, but interestingly, I've kind of pretty much worked on the rendering rewrite, so I've only really worked on code that we're completely rewriting to make nicer. So I'm not exactly sure what I would make better, as I just worked on making something better. Yeah, this is a great end to start at, guys.
I would probably say for me, the toolbox, which actually we're going to be rewriting, I think, because we just took it out of closure. So I think it'll be fun to make some decisions there.
Oh, wait, actually, no, I have opinions. Well, so I don't know about rewriting, but like just restructuring the file so there aren't just like, I think under core, there's just like so many, and it's so hard to find things. So hard. Oh, just everything with underscore SVG, if those could all have some more similar structure.
Hi, everyone. I just realized I haven't actually introduced myself because I have a talk, but tomorrow. I'm Sam. I, until recently, was on a MakeCode team, and I gave a talk here last year. So if you were here, I gave the TypeScript talk. So I've since moved to the Bay and joined the Google team here. And I think my response to that answer would be more around the overall structure of Blockly and the kind of the developer workflow. So for that would be, using ES6 as all of our modules makes it much easier to kind of publish to NPM and kind of be part of the ecosystem, maybe even TypeScript, which is essentially what we use Clojure for types. But it's kind of much more, it's got much better tooling in today's code editors and all that. So it would help kind of our job be much easier.
I have two things I'll touch on briefly. One is, as Monica mentioned, about things that end with _SVG. Blockly was the headless part of Blockly was kind of a secondary feature. And there's some structure in the types and the inheritance that I wish we could have revisited. And that's on our list to keep looking at and find ways around. And then the other one, block definition. So I've seen a lot of different ways of defining blocks from different people. I've seen them at very different levels, whether it's for teachers who will use it, whether it's for developers and so on and so forth. And I think that Blockly's structure on that, the nesting on it doesn't quite match. It's very hard to communicate about. And I think there could have been a different nesting that would be equally powerful, but a little bit easier to communicate about.
So first of all, I would never want to rewrite Blockly. It is a huge amount of work and very complicated. But the one thing that I wish we could change, and we cannot at this point because it is so critical to the way people use it, is the save format. Funny note, for my master's, I also wrote a visual block programming language, which I think was a couple of years before Blockly came out, but mine was not nearly as complete because I only had a few months to write it. But one of the things I was very happy with was the save format, because it had back references to things. And I think that is something that's a little bit frustrating for consistency with Blockly, is being able to have consistent references throughout the save format. And also being in XML instead of JSON.
Actually, my answer is remarkably similar. First of all, I'll say that there are many, many, many design decisions that I regret. But most of them, Rachel's fixed. So, but yes, the save format is the one that is impossible to fix. And specifically, I would say JSON instead of XML. That would be one. And the second one is the next two blocks that are stacked on top of each other. The one that's below is a child in the XML. And so you look at your XML and it goes like this. And that's just bad. But in my defense, when I was designing this, my programs weren't that big. So anyway, that's the XML, just the whole format of XML and the next in particular. If we get rid of next, then you also have to have groups, which is perfectly acceptable. And I looked at the two and I thought, next is better, especially because next is the way the SVG tags link together. So it's actually it was almost a one-to-one mapping with the SVG and the XML. And in my really, really early days, I was thinking maybe the SVG can actually be save file format. That was a terrible idea. But you're an honorary member of the Blockly team. What's your
It did backfire. If I was going to change one thing about how Blockly is written or how Blockly is structured, I would probably start at the low level and work my way back up, because I feel like I've been looking at connections and serialization, also disposing a little bit. So a lot of communication between different components, and there's bleed between them. And what I would want to do is focus on isolating things a little bit more. That's sort of vague for everybody here, but that's what I would focus on, is isolating things more into modules.
Yeah, and on that note, we have kind of been going down that path. The nice thing about putting everything into modules, and that's not kind of the NPM sort of modules, but just a structural module, is that you can eventually pick and choose. If you don't care about, say, workspace search whenever that's around, you could just not have that included, and then you don't have to ship that part off the code. Yeah.
I was just going to piggyback on Neil's discussion about the XML format. If anyone is interested, you can come talk to me, but we have a library we use for doing analysis of App Inventor projects, which will do the transformation into the logical sequence of statements rather than having the nested things. So if that's something that bugs you, let me know and I can help you out.
And I think actually last year, Neil tried to swap out the XML at this point. As a result of this conference last year, and ran into some troubles basically that we can't do that now. Neil says, in particular, shadow blocks made that very difficult.
I think that answers the question I was about to ask, actually. What was the technical problem with that rather than the backwards compatibility? Is it just the shadow blocks?
It is all about backwards compatibility. We are able to load the very first Blockly save program today. The XML format we can expand upon, but we can never break. And when we thought last year during this conference that we'd found a path so where we could migrate to not having nexts, but then it collided with shadow blocks, and there was no way forward that we could see while maintaining backwards compatibility. If you don't worry about backwards compatibility, all sorts of things are possible. Or backwards compatibility or interchangeability with anybody else who's using Blockly. So that's not something to dismiss too lightly.
It would require core changes.
Yep.
No plugin point for us to add in a new format.
Yeah, just to repeat from the person who asked the question, I didn't catch your name. Mark. Yeah, there's no plugin format for the serialization, and I don't think anyone's planning that.
So at the conference last year at the hackathon, I actually implemented that, but we never got it in as a pull request, mostly because we have additional features that we've plugged into the XML that we use for versioning App Inventor projects that we basically have to strip out before we parse it, because otherwise the Blockly parser is just like, I don't know what this is, but cool. So, but yeah, so we have like folders and things that we're working on, and we do want to have extensibility of the XML, and the whole point of XML is that it should be extensible. So, yes, at some point we will have that.
I think also just at the point, if you don't care about backwards compatibility, you could just jump to JSON, which we ran experiments recently, and it's about 20% faster. So maybe we'll accept pull requests.
So Rachel, would we add a method override for doing your own serialization?
I don't see why not, but I would be very careful with that, because that would be splitting. That's a significant split. And we are trying to, for instance, take a lot of the previous forks of Blockly and get those back together and get them closer. At least in this coming quarter, that's really my focus. Actually, more than a quarter. This is going to take more than a quarter, is getting things generally closer together. And so I'm a little hesitant to commit to spreading that back out again.
Hi, this is Andrew again. I'm going to say events and mutators are the reasons that you're probably not going to ever see it happen.
And also, I just want to chime in, since I've spent about half this conference snarking at Neil about his code. One, Neil's pretty great, in case you couldn't tell. And two, the Blockly code is, I believe someone said brutally clean to me once. It may not be structurally across the entire thing, but in terms of individual bits of code, that's something that when I came in, Neil had already done an incredible job of, and there's a high standard on, and that's made it much easier to work with, I think, and it makes it much easier also for other people to contribute. So at the level of each function and so on and so forth, and annotating things clearly, I think that's something that's good about the library, and we're going to keep that up.
So I had a question and I've tried it and it looks better now because the last time I used Blockly was like 4 years ago, and I didn't like the drag handlers because they'd make me drop a bunch of frames. And now I'm not like, I would drop down to 30 frames per second instead of 60 while I'm dragging around, but that's just fine. So I want to ask a bigger question, which is about maybe has to do with the accessibility with that AST. Are there thoughts about instead of like, oh, I can generate some JavaScript code. Cool. I have these different generators to generate code. Instead, generating some intermediate representation that would be, generate some kind of tree that I could use outside. And I guess that would step me outside of the Blockly ecosystem for generating code. Now I have a more generic AST and I could transform that separately. Is there any thoughts on that? Yeah.
So Sam said that's what the XML is. I don't see that as something that we would build in. That would be the equivalent of having another generator. And so we generally would suggest that as you write your generator for that. I don't see that we're going to build that as a generator that we maintain in the core library.
Hi, sorry. Maybe I have more of a technical question, but I'm just curious if anybody in the room has trouble with like block deletion events. And so where we need them is doing Blockly that programs hardware and microcontrollers. User wants to hook up a sensor to it, and so we actually have a block that initializes that sensor. And then because that initializer is now out on the field, other blocks recognize it, say, hey, that's out there and whatnot. But if that initialized block gets deleted, then we need to know that, or the other blocks need to know that. And so we find ourselves doing a lot of like inter-block communication, because within the on-change event for a deletion, I can't access the block anymore. I can access its XML, but then I have to like parse through the fields and see that. So I was wondering if there's a way to do, basically to get a block object that's detached from the workspace, but I can still access it, like get the fields from it, that sort of thing.
So we have a different variable system in App Inventor than Core Blockly does. And one of the things that allows us to do is you can rename variables in one spot and it will rename them globally. And the way to do that is by setting it on the workspace. And then similarly, if you delete the global initialization block, we will then go and mark all the other ones bad, but the workspace is, we delegate that to the workspace rather than delegating it to the individual blocks to maintain that. So that could be one way. And then you could just maintain some state on the workspace with additional parameters that you could then use for doing your updates that you need to do. So it's one way of approaching it.
Another way is each of your blocks is referencing this initialization block. Okay, when those blocks are created, can it make a note of the ID of the initialization block? Because if so, and it locally has that ID, it can simply look at the events and not bother parsing the XML, but instead look for delete events, and it has a helpful field for, here are the IDs of all the deleted fields. I wouldn't need to, because you would simply store the ID of the initialization. And so you can see, oh, my initializer was deleted, and your work is done. You don't have to parse anything.
Quick correction, that would get you the IDs of the deleted blocks, not of the deleted fields. Yeah. Just misspoke there.
Can I ask you a question about MakeCode then? Yeah, because we were interested in generating blocks from TypeScript code, but we couldn't quite work out how it worked. We couldn't work out whether you generated block definitions or what happened. Like what comes out of the TypeScript to make blocks. I couldn't find anywhere in the code base that seemed to generate a block definition, so I couldn't work out how it actually worked.
So we have a syntax that is like comments above like the function that runs.
Yeah.
And we use that to spit out the blocks. Sam might actually know more about this as a former.
Yeah, so the comments generate the block definitions. So similar to JSON block definitions, we use JavaScript, so not JSON, but it's also just generating block definitions from the comments, and then that's all that Blockly needs to actually know what a block looks like. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was specifically looking for the JSON block definition generation somewhere. That's obviously why I couldn't find it then.
It uses JavaScript, right, not JSON, so I could tell you what file to look at.
I'll ask you that later then.
So I know we did the feature request part earlier in the day, but I've got another one, which actually we've asked multiple times for now, I think. But since you're redoing the rendering, could we consider having a way of registering different icons for blocks? Because we would like to, right now we have this do it feature in App Inventor where you can select any block and say run the code, and it will attach the output to the block, but it puts it inside the comment field, which is rather annoying, I think, because it's not a comment, it's some transient output, right? So it'd be nice if we could have a separate kind of like do it result icon. And similarly, we've been playing around and experimenting with this idea of being able to do breakpoints and things. So, having an icon for that. And it just seems like it would be a way of allowing us to attach all sorts of different information. Similarly, there was a request of having sort of like in the real-time collaboration, the ability to sort of code review blocks. So you could attach sort of a review icon and say, hey, I don't approve of you doing this here, but keep it separate from like the comment block or the comment icon, which is more of this is what the intention of this block is to do. So could we have an API or something where we could actually attach multiple icons?
So that probably looks a lot like the field registration API that we have, that we've put in place in the last year, that lets you say this is a field type and I'll go find it. And similarly, I think we'll probably end up doing something for icons. Okay. I think there's also after all the work on fields and rendering generally, I think next up is a look at icons. The code structure there is quite strange.
Right, and we already have custom icons we've added anyway, so it'd be nice to reconcile that and make it so that we could have some common framework for adding them rather than doing what we currently do, which is going into core and adding a bunch of extra icons. So.
Yeah, I think that would be a registry of some form.
I just wanted to ask out of curiosity, why you'd go for an icon versus a field in that case. Lost the mic.
Primarily because we don't consider them to be part of the intention of the block, right? So I would consider the fields to be things that semantically are sort of representing what the block is doing, whereas the icons tend to be more metadata about the block. So like we have, we use the warnings icons, but we also in App Inventor have error icons, which are stronger and mean that we will not do code generation for that block because there's really something we wouldn't be able to get over. And then obviously comments are comments, right? So they're more about the block itself rather than what the block is doing.
Yeah, so like another way of saying that, fields per block basis, and then icons could be like, for all blocks, this is how comments show up, and for all blocks, this is how breakpoints show up or whatever.
I'm curious whether the bubble part of it is important to you.
You have a question? Yeah.
Yes.
So Neil also had a great question for the rest of you. How old is your version of Blockly, and what is the merging experience like?
Yeah. We could just go with like a year old. Show of hands. Less than a year. Okay. 2 years. All right. 3. Okay. Getting 4 years. All right. We got one. More than 4 years. Kite dog, what are you doing? Yeah, sure.
Okay, so our current version is less than a year old, but before that we had come from one that was, I think, 3 years maybe, and what the big change was the variable thing, and we're still actually struggling with that a little bit. It would be nice to be able to define or put the item variable back and force it to stay there, and we have some kind of weird workarounds for that currently, and yeah, just a default variable. User can't delete it. It's there because, again, hardware sensors. We have like a default item as this is where you need to put a variable later on, or you can just use item. But restricting the user's ability to get rid of like what would be a default variable.
I would definitely file a feature request for that. All right. Yeah, file a feature request.
So I answered 3 years, but in fact it's variable because we also have many student projects which have been done over the course of the years, which for one reason or another haven't been merged, but we always want to revisit them as things develop. So like I'm actually playing around with the folders implementation that a student did, which is circa 2013, I think, or 2014. All right, and so part of it is just not only is it Blockly is moving quickly, but when we need to stop at a point and reconcile stuff that's 5 years old with stuff that's 3 years old, and then at some point we'll have to reconcile all of it again when we move even further forward. So that's really the challenge. And I mean, my pet peeve, if I can have a pet peeve, is the renaming of public APIs. And so then that just breaks our code and we have to go all over the place and try to figure out what the appropriate new thing is to call it.
You're going to love.
I know I'm going to love it.
I'm going to give a quick comment on the rename of public APIs. I'm not even going to, this is somewhere around the level of an excuse. A lot of Blockly wasn't explicitly public or not. And a lot of what we've been trying to do is figure out what things that we want to rename are public and which ones aren't. And when we get that really wrong, I'm very sorry. We have switched to having an actual semantic version number. So we did a full version bump, major bump on the last release because we did renames at a level that we knew is not minorly fixable. And we are trying to, we did 2 big releases. The last one was big and this one is big. And what we're trying to do is then stop doing big changes and let it sit so that people can get back to using it. But that does mean that we crammed many changes into one place. And if we're breaking your stuff, in general, for all of you, if we're breaking your things, please tell us. We try. We don't know. We would like to know.
So we're on the July release now, and that was by far the most painful upgrade I've ever done. But it mainly because we had we'd rolled our own TypeScript definitions, and we wrote a lot in TypeScript, and then the official TypeScript came out, and we decided to use that. And ours we'd hacked away, so that was quite painful. And all of our extensions were written in just plain JavaScript, following your style. And there was so many hidden bugs from things being changed because we've hacked in quite a lot lots of private methods get overridden and stuff like that. And I found that the easiest path in the end was to use your TypeScript definitions and convert all of our extensions to TypeScript. And that immediately just found loads of bugs. And now all of our extensions are now in TypeScript. We have to do a lot of as any, but it's a lot easier to upgrade now.
Yeah, so the motivation for that came actually from MakeCode, and that was one of our ways to actually tell when something changed in Blockly that's going to affect us, because TypeScript will just tell you when a method doesn't exist anymore. Anybody else that'd like to share some merge experiences?
So App Inventor, because it was sort of the first Blockly customer, also had this bad habit of having the Blockly sources checked into our repo, which, so the real painful one, oh yeah. so the real painful one for us was the one we did 3 years ago when we needed to reconcile all the changes that had happened, but we didn't have any repository history to work from. So I had to work out which SVN revision, because of course the previous version had not come from Git, it had come from SVN. We had come from, and then compute the diff on that and try to reapply that. Because again, we make a lot of changes to Blockly core, which we have discussed, and then reapply that. So now we do maintain our own fork on GitHub that we use, that we're trying to keep sort of parallel with the Google one, but eventually it'd be nice if we didn't have to do that anymore.
I think I'm single-handedly responsible for every major, like, world-breaking change in Blockly.
Can I just say though that the new Blockly is snappier? It's awesome. Like,
can you repeat that into the mic?
yes, stuff broke, but I really like what I see and what has come and the improvements. So they're worth it.
That's the hope. Yeah, we've said before at this, and we'll say it again. I'll say it again over the next couple of days. Is we're trying to drive down the amount of changes you have to make in core Blockly, so that we can drive down the amount of merge pain if we change anything internal. Part of that is actually explicitly defining which things are internal and which things are external. Anyone else? I'm really tempted to put the people on that side of the row on the spot. We have one more.
Just give them the mic.
Yeah.
They have to answer the next question.
So I want the question I didn't ask last time. I am still interested in if you see kind of real-time, well, the web definition of real-time applications as kind of a supported case. If I have something where I make a transformation on my AST, on my Blockly set of blocks, and ideally by the next frame, but if it was async and it was a few frames later, that'd be fine. If I can have that parsed thing, and now my program's running that thing, and the reason I ask if it's a supported thing is I remember reading one of Neil's blog posts from a long time ago where he said something like, programming is not about just poking things, it's about making hypotheses and trying to predict things. And at the time I was coming from the other direction. It's like, no, programming is about just poking things, just experimenting. And I'm excited about that, the potential for, what if I pick up this block, put it over here, and get that feedback if 500 milliseconds later. So I just wonder if that philosophy extends maybe to current development. Is it reasonable to want to quickly get a new parse tree out and quickly have my application running that new parse tree?
Give you a hard one.
Yeah, I can take that if you want. Okay, that was more than I was expecting to hand over to you. Sorry about that. That is what App Inventor does. That's also what Scratch does with having the VM. I think there are a couple parts of that. One is whether it's easy to make those changes, and I think the event stuff is what makes it easy to shove those changes in real time. Blockly does fundamentally generate a pile of text.
Can it do it?
Can it do it fast? It's fast, yeah. But there's
drop frames if that's a UI thread, something else. It seems like.
So the question was whether that would drop frames if you're in a UI thread, and I don't believe it would. It should be fast enough unless you're reaching the level that App Inventor is reaching with their workspaces, in which case I have no idea. But there's you would still be doing a lot of building of your own runtime essentially in parallel with that and keeping it in sync.
And so, yes, the other thing with App Inventor is that when you make a change to the blocks, like in your code, we only resend the stack that was changed. We don't resend the entire program. So when we get a change, we are really just figuring out which stack has changed, and then we compute the tree for that, which is much, much faster than doing the whole workspace over. But we can only get away with that in the blocks. So.
All right, here's what might be a fun question. So obviously you've done a lot of things over the years around sort of re-implementing things, exposing more APIs and such like that. But based on the now, however many years of experience with Blockly, if you were doing it again, is there anything you would do sort of basically different? Something that you can't really do now because there's just something that's so core to how Blockly is now that would prevent that, but something you would do differently? Oh, I guess I missed that. My apologies.
So that's very similar to the question Beck asked earlier. She asked if we rewrote Blockly today, what would we do differently? Okay, but I think you specifically asked what's kind of core to Blockly that we would change. Yeah, that we cannot change because it is so core to how Blockly works.
Right.
Yeah, for me, that's still the XML format for saving.
As a couple of people mentioned, variables, I rewrote those. And so I'm looking only at things that I have personally written into Blockly that I might still change. And actually, no, Flyouts, the fact that Flyouts can go anywhere, that seemed like a great idea when it was my first year on the project. And I was like, oh my goodness, I can make this like, why should I make it so you can have one horizontal flyout when you could have horizontal flyouts everywhere? And the trade-off on complexity and amount of code that I have left sitting around versus how many people use that has been very bad, I think. And also in terms of, I doubt that the experience using the horizontal flyouts is that good because we stopped tuning them after not that long because we stopped interacting with people who were using them. So out of the things that I've put into Blockly, I would pull that back out if I could. I don't know if anyone else wants to.
I'm going to answer a different question. I mostly just say that cross-browser support is quite of a big pain point for Blockly. And if I could have it any other way, I just wouldn't support IE. But we still do.
So I've been working on keyboard navigation, which is completely separate from a lot of things. So I'm pretty happy in my little bubble. So,
I mean, I think I +1 to what Sam said. I just would like to use shiny new things that won't work for everyone. But, you know, it's nice. But if we could, that'd be nice.
Hi, so with my 0.02 years of experience on Blockly, I'm excited to find things that I would change.
How many days?
Well, I think I said 0.02, or I meant 0.05, or did I? I took approximately 1 week out of 52 weeks. 0.02, right?
So on the subject of using shiny new things, if Blockly had been started 1 year earlier than it was, at that time, SVG support in browsers was not good enough to do what we are doing. So I would have had no choice but to use Flash. And so, yeah, we would not be now, when I started Blockly, I was looking at two languages, JavaScript and Dart. And I actually spent quite a bit of time experimenting with Dart, and Dart just wasn't quite ready. They were still moving the language around. One day you could add two strings together. The next day they decided that was a bad feature and removed the plus operator. It was a very unstable language. And so I chose not to use it because it wasn't quite ready. If Blockly had been started 1 year later, I would have used Dart. And how many people here think that would have been a good idea? Really? Wow, I've got a couple of Dart fans. But yeah, and if it was today, I would look very strongly at TypeScript. So that's one of the early changes that you can't change. But fortunately, we hit something that seems to work.
It sounds like I'm a very new Blockly user. I've used it in my own test projects, but it sounds like a lot of people have performance issues with JavaScript. Are there any thoughts, since WebAssembly is like kind of the new hotness in the industry, of moving certain components to the WebAssembly layer?
Doesn't support IE. So no.
So in addition to using like a 3.5-year-old Blockly, we're also using like a 3.5-year-old JavaScript interpreter as the runtime, Neil's interpreter. And I know this is kind of out of the scope of the Blockly itself, but I'm kind of curious, as Blockly's matured, how have you guys viewed kind of that runtime environment? Are there like certain runtime environments that have become very popular?
So the Java 3, how old is your JavaScript interpreter? A copy? And you've got performance issues? Yeah, update. It's been, not a lot has happened, but I think about 1.5 years ago, it got way faster. So really, really trivial changes made ridiculous improvements. And bugs are continuing to be fixed. But the JavaScript interpreter is trying to do one thing, and exactly one thing, and that's execute ES5. So it will never be extended to ES6. That's what transpilers are for. So the work on it is getting lower and lower and lower as we reach parity with what we're trying to get. However, I recommend you watch my talk on how to execute Blockly programs. It's at next year's conference.
But in general, Blockly is not very opinionated about what runtime you use, and that's why we can get everybody using different runtimes with the same framework.